I've never really formulated a definitive list of favourite authors, but my first newly read author of 2025 will be added to that list because I just binged 3 books in a row by this man, and I'm going to talk about them. This is Percival Everett, one of my new favourite writers. Welcome back to StoryTube. What's the story? So I'm going to talk about 3 books today. Percival Everett has now cemented himself in the spots of my favourite authors. And I want to talk about why. So I started off the year, my first read of 2025 was The Trees. And then I loved that book so much that I immediately picked up Erasure by Percy. And as I was reading those 2 books, my good friend Jimmy from the Fantasy Network was reading James by the same author and updating me on how much he was loving it. And I was skeptical about reading James because I'm not a huge fan of Huckleberry Finn. And if you don't know anything about this book, this is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain from Jim's perspective, who is Huckleberry's slave companion on that journey in that book. And Jimmy convinced me with the very persuasive words of, "Read it, Carlos." So I just did, because I loved The Trees and Erasure. So 3 books in succession by one author. I don't do that very often, but let me tell you why I did. Percival Everett has various themes that he likes to write about. He is a writer of, I would describe it as artful fiction. I don't think he very much likes categories himself. There's a lot of debate within his books about what is literary, what is trash, essentially, and what is entertainment, pleasure. Where do we draw the lines between what has merit and what doesn't? Does that even really matter? And does it all just boil down to something being good and something being shit? If a piece of art brings some sort of value to the world, then that's good. If it is not bringing value, or if it is harming or perpetuating stereotypes, then I think that's where Percival Everett wants to examine it. Similar to another of my favorite authors, Adrian Tchaikovsky, strange comparison to be making, these themes run through all of his books. Now, granted, I haven't read all of Percival Everett's books. I haven't read all of Adrian Tchaikovsky's books, but there are things that I noticed that they like to write about and examine, and in each book, they do it in really drastically different ways in terms of style or tone. Elements of Percival Everett remain the same throughout in terms of a biting sense of humor and a sense of irony, and that irony is really what drives his sensibilities. And it's the aspect of him that makes him one of my new favorite writers. I appreciate an ironic sense of humor. This is very also present in both of my cultural backgrounds. An ironic sense of humor and a very kind of sardonic sarcasm is very present in Irish culture and in northern Spanish culture, in Galician culture. There is something called retranca gallega, which is from my west coast of Spain. My grandmother, my abuela, talks about it all the time, and it's basically high levels of irony that sometimes might rub another person up the wrong way if you're not speaking that language. Language is another fundamental aspect of Percival Everett's books, and again, he's dealing with them in very different ways across these 3 books. I like to think of these books as along a sort of ironic spectrum or satirical spectrum, and he is less satirical absurdist or less overtly ironic in some and way in the extreme in others. And when I get to the individual books, I'll say where they kind of fall on that spectrum. But I'll just go with what I read first, and that is The Trees. And I would say that this book is on the extreme end of all of that spectrum. This is an absurdist, satirical comedy police procedural crime novel about a series of murders of good white folk down in Money, Mississippi. And at each murder, the body of a black man appears with the severed testicles of the white person in his hand. This body of this black man disappears every time, but it also resembles Emmett Till. But this book is, I'd like to describe it as the Coen brothers, like Fargo, just set in the Deep South with racism as the central theme. So here we're looking at good white Christian folk and where those sort of overt levels of racism still exist in white America, the more subtle levels of racism, and kind of all along that spectrum. But there are some of the most heinously racist people in this book to an absurd degree. But I think the genius of this book is that he makes it so absurdist, and yet these people still exist. So there's almost a level of angry humor and angry comedy. So this has a lot of laugh out loud moments, but there's an anger underneath it, and it really makes it quite propulsive to read. The chapters are very short, it's very chopped. This is like a 300-page book, and there's like 100 chapters or more. It's quite dialogue heavy, and the essential premise then is two black detectives are sent down to the town of Money, Mississippi to deal with these white deputies and sheriff in the investigation of these murders. And then loads of copycat killings start to pop up all across America, and they break open this kind of underground rebellion that's trying to get justice for past lynchings in the States, and confronting that dark side of American history, and confronting white America with that dark side of American history, and confronting the US government with that. If you're into crime novels, if you're into Fargo, if you're into the Coen brothers in general, that style of absurdist humor, dial to 11. And if the subject matter interests you, I can't recommend this book highly enough. Even if you're not into the things that I just described, this is essentially just a work of literary fiction. I think these categories, Percival Everett tries to battle against them. He has written essentially many different genres, but he is just trying to create art with all of the forms and narrative functions and elements and archetypes of basically any genre you can think of. He has other books that are satirical spy novels or spy thrillers, or he has westerns. He has straight up just introspective literary fiction, like we'll talk about with Erasure. He has commentary on classics, like with James. He kind of operates in many different areas, and he uses conventions and narrative forms from those to play with these ideas and themes of racial stereotyping, just racism in America, and what art really is. I think those are really his central themes, and language is a big part of that. So I read The Trees in like 24 hours at the start of the year, and loved it so much, loved Percival Everett's voice so much, and that irony, that I decided to go into probably his most famous book now, and that is Erasure. So I think the three books that I read are probably his three most well-known works. He has written a ton of novels, like over 40, I think. And Erasure was made into a film about a year ago called American Fiction with Jeffrey Wright. I forgot to mention as well that The Trees was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2022, and James was shortlisted for the Booker Prize this last year. So this guy's getting some recognition in the literary community now. Erasure is about a black author living in America. He's from kind of a upper middle class, wealthy black family in like the DC, Maryland area. He's sort of modestly successful, but he publishes quite dense and difficult to penetrate kind of books that don't really have mass market appeal. And in the course of this book, he discovers that another black author has published a book that he considers trash, essentially. It has all of the negative racial stereotypes that you can think of black people in the hood, selling drugs and you know, baby daddies disappearing and loads of baby mamas and all of this kind of negative stereotyping that exists in media and in literature. And this woman becomes a bestseller in the book. And people praise her for her raw authenticity and displaying the lives of real black people in America. And this really fucking pisses him off. And he writes what he considers to be a satirical piss-take novel, a joke, sends it to his agent and says, this is the shit that's getting published these days. And ironically, his agent manages to get him a lucrative deal for that satirical novel that he publishes. And you read a good excerpt chunk of that novel within this novel, and it's honestly, it's terrible, but it's really, really funny. And he plays up all those stereotypes as well in this book. But I think the heart of Erasure is actually the character himself and the journey that he's going on spiritually and with his family. The main character's mother is coming down with dementia. The family are kind of in turmoil. The father has been dead for a number of years, and he is kind of recontextualizing his relationship with his father as well after discovering some letters. And then you get some flashbacks to when he was a kid and seeing the relationship. He's from a family of, like I said, upper middle class, and his siblings are all kind of science heads, doctors. His father was as well. But his father kind of treated him with a favoritism because he showed a different way of thinking, a creative way, an artistic side to him. There's a sort of sensitivity to him as a child. And his father treats him differently to how he treats his siblings. And this creates all of these complex interpersonal familial relationships. And I think it's honestly the heart of this book, and probably why it's my favorite of the three. I'm still not sure. This book really was, I think, the essence of what Percival Everett tries to write about. The character also struggles a lot with what is art? What makes something artistic? Who gets to decide that? In his quest to be ironic and satirical, did he completely miss somebody else doing exactly the same thing and basically pulling the wool over the eyes of white America and tricking them? And there's all of that still, and he starts to question, am I just a pretentious dickhead? And I really love that sort of internal questioning that he does in this book, and it was really cool to read about. The humor and the irony in this is not quite as angry as it is in The Trees, at least overtly so, or aggressively so. This one is a little more fatigued in a way. It's a sort of a tired dejection, and I think he matches that with the style and all of the sort of themes that he discusses with language, with form, with sort of narratology. There's a lot of stuff about even semiotics and hermeneutic theory and stuff that I studied a little bit of in college, but doesn't necessarily interest me. If you're into all of that stuff, narratology, narrative form, really like critical theory about literary criticism, this really, really will work for you. If you're not into that stuff, there are sections of this book that will be less interesting to you, but it's not the focus. But he does match his style, his sort of flow of writing to the tone of each book, in my opinion. And I think that adds a level of artistry and genius to his writing that I really appreciate. He is challenging you to question what you bring to a text and how you interpret a text. And that's honestly what I like most about him. That and his sense of humor is probably what I like most. But he's really challenging you to question your own biases and your own interpretations. And where does the relationship lie between an author writing a text and putting it out in the world and somebody else reading it and it being your very own experience? He really challenges you to think about that and where that relationship ends. And does it even really matter? Because as soon as you read a text and you get something out of it, that is your piece of art and your experience with that art. Honestly, nobody can really take that away from you, and I think that's what he's ultimately talking about. And after Erasure, with my mate Jimmy's very persuasive words, I read James. James recommended James. How about that? So I'd heard about this book last year when I was working in the bookshop. We got a ton of copies in, obviously, because it was newly published. And then it got the push for the Booker Prize, and it was shortlisted. And the cover, honestly, was really striking to me. I really love the cover, the orange. I like it. It's a cool looking book. But when I found out it was a Huckleberry Finn retelling, my interest waned. I'm sorry, Mark Twain fans. Huckleberry Finn is not my favourite book. But I will say, and also after talking about it with Jimmy as well, this is just a far more interesting perspective to tell this story with. It is essentially a different story as well, because my memory was hazy on Huckleberry Finn, but I know that Huck and Jim get separated quite a lot in that book. So this is essentially a different story with just some plot beats that are similar. There's also a couple of twists in here that I don't want to spoil. And it's also important to note that you don't need to read Huck Finn before reading this book. And honestly, this book is more interesting than Huckleberry Finn. But I think just the fact that what Percival Everett likes to examine, he likes to examine racial identity in America. He wants to give you other experiences of black people in America that he doesn't see represented in media, in art, in literature. And in this one, he goes directly to one of the great American novels and says, I want this story to be a black man's story, and a black man's story during slavery. And honestly, it's a far more interesting way to tell this story. So Jim in this book, the basic concept actually that he made it even more interesting was that Jim puts on a facade. So the Jim we know from Huckleberry Finn and the way he speaks is a facade. And Jim actually goes by James. This is very important to him. His name is very important to him. His control of language is very important to him. His ability to read is very important to him. He sneaks into his slave owner's library early on in the book, and we come to learn that he has been doing this for years. And he's taught himself to read, and he's also taught himself to read some pretty heavy shit. He talks about Greek philosophers, all of this kind of stuff, German philosophers. He uses this to shape his worldview and to equip him to survive as a slave in 1800s America. And he's teaching his kids how to speak slave talk, like this, like my master asks me. He teaches this dialect to his kids, but when he's with other slaves and there's no white people around, he's very erudite and speaks proper English and seems very highly educated, even though he's not he's self-educated. And this language is kind of the central theme of James. And that idea of reading and a text being your own experience and knowledge becoming the ultimate tool. What I find really interesting about his exploration of the use of language in James is, to give you an example for myself. Now, I'm not American and I'm obviously not black. I'm not going to speak for the experience of either American people or black people, and most importantly, I'm not going to speak to the experience of black slaves in the 1800s. But my own experience with my own accent and the way I speak has been somewhat similar. I, growing up, had quite a strong Dublin accent, a North Dublin accent, and it softened a lot over the years, and it softened when I was in class, because I would present myself. The way you're hearing me now is kind of where my accent has settled over the years, and it might seem strong still to you guys listening, but I'll tell you right now, it was a lot stronger when I was 15 years old, I'll tell you that. And I've had to soften that for many reasons. One, from work and working with non-native English speakers so that they can understand what I'm saying. Number two, because teachers said that we sounded stupid and uneducated. There are sections in James towards the end where it loses a little bit of believability for me when every single slave that James meets drops this facade and speaks like what essentially a white person at that time would speak like, or a highly educated person at that time would speak like. But this, on the spectrum of irony and satire and absurdism, is a lot lower. So that sort of heightened sense of satire lost a little bit of there was a bit of dissonance there. And it's probably my only criticism of the book. And there is a twist towards the end of this as well that I don't know if it was entirely necessary. I won't mention it now. But there is a fundamental reveal about the story of Huckleberry Finn and Jim that is vastly different in James. And I'm not sure if that was necessary, but also this idea of language and associating it with intelligence, and also the fact that every single slave at this time was doing exactly the same thing. Absolutely a thing that some, slaves taught themselves to read, or even just spoke not in that slave dialect, and kept up appearances so that they let white masters believe that they were more intelligent than they were. Absolutely, that is a thing. There just became a certain level of disconnect because this book did not feel quite so satirical as the other two. However, with Percival Everett's approach to writing and all the themes that he has, he's made me sort of sit down and think, is that me just interpreting his text with my own bias and my own upbringing and kind of fighting against that? Or is it his actual idea that he's putting forward? Or what? Those questions are kind of swirling around. I think it makes James maybe the most interesting of the three. And that idea, that playfulness with language, and that what language means for your personal identity, and particularly in this book for racial identity, I just found really, really interesting. Because if you know anything about me, if you follow the channel at all, I talk a lot about dialect and accent as being one of my favorite things in the world, not just in like books and literature and movies and stuff, but I've even like sort of casually studied it. I did theatre when I was a kid. I did accent classes. I'm fairly okay doing accents with a little practice. But dialect fascinates me, and I think evolution of language fascinates me. And I don't think any one accent or way of speaking is an indicator of one's intelligence, because there are people who would speak the way I maybe used to speak, or still do, to other ears, that would maybe call me a scumbag or a thug or something like that. I've had to work on pronouncing my TH. Thug was even hard for me to say there, but I've got practice over the years. But I think what Percival Everett is really trying to do is say that having a control and an agency over how you choose to speak and how you choose to express yourself, either with how you speak or with your art and what you say, and putting pen or pencil to paper, as in the case of James in this book, the written word, that gives you your agency, that gives you your identity. You can then make your identity whatever it is you want it to be. Like, without spoiling anything in this book, the very last line of this book, James meets someone and they say, "Are you Jim?" They say a very unsavory word before that. That's kind of the point. "Are you something, Jim?" And he says, "No, I'm James." And they ask, "James what?" And he says, "Just James." And that's the last line of the book. And it kind of hammers home that theme of I control my fucking destiny. Because I choose how I speak, I choose how I present myself, express myself to you, and how I identify myself. And you don't get to have that power over me. And I think that's where I've landed in all my swirling thoughts about language, specifically in James. And I fucking love it. To sum up, I read 3 books in quick succession by one author. I'm probably going to continue. I've bought like 6 or 7 more Percival Everett books. I think next on deck for me will be I Am Not Sidney Poitier, which is about a man who is quite literally named not Sidney Poitier. and resembles the famous actor Sidney Poitier. He also has another book called Dr. No, which is a piss take on James Bond and sort of that spy thriller novel. But it's, set in America, and it's about, again, racial tensions. And there's a character in that who is an expert in nothing. And I think that book is a little bit about controlling narrative and where does truth lie. So I think those two are probably highest on my list for my next Percival Everett read. But anyway, if you have read Percival Everett, please let me know in the comments. Let me know which ones you've read. If you've read all of the ones that I've read, these 3, and some of the ones that I mentioned that I want to read, let me know. If you have never read Percival Everett, which one sounds most interesting to you? If you like the video, give it a like. If you dislike it, give it a dislike. And if you're new here, subscribe, stick around. I'll be continuing my Percival Everett journey, that's for sure. And we do all sorts of stuff. We talk about all sorts of books on the channel. So stick around, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.